Canada just said no to the most powerful man on earth. And what he was asking for could decide whether millions of Americans keep their lights on, their crops watered, and their cities dry. This is not a trade war. This is a water war, and it has already begun. Most people have never heard of the Columbia River Treaty, but right now, it is the most important document in North America that almost no one is talking about. And if it collapses, because of what is happening between Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, the consequences will land directly on your electricity bill, your grocery prices, and the stability of an entire region. Stay with this, because the full picture is far more alarming than the headlines suggest. Drop a comment right now if you think water should ever be used as a geopolitical weapon. We read every single one, and we update this story daily. To understand what is at stake, you have to go back. Memorial Day, 1948.
A wall of water 15 feet high comes crashing into Vanport, Oregon, a city built for wartime shipyard workers just outside Portland. The Columbia River, the mightiest river system in the American West, erases it. Homes gone, lives gone, and a brutal lesson delivered. This river does not respect borders, and it cannot be left unmanaged. Over the next 16 years, the United States and Canada sat down and built something remarkable. The Columbia River Treaty, ratified in 1964, became the backbone of transboundary water management across North America. Canada controls the upstream flow from British Columbia. It manages reservoir storage that prevents American cities from flooding every spring. In return, Canada receives a share of the electricity generated by 31 Columbia River Basin dams operated by the Bonneville Power Administration. Think carefully about what that arrangement represents. Not a favor, not charity. A bilateral system so elegant that it has functioned for 6 decades without crisis. Until now. Here is the number that should stop you cold. The Columbia River Basin's dams generate 40% of all the hydropower in the United States. 40%. This is not a regional footnote. This is a structural pillar of the Pacific Northwest's energy grid. Data centers powering artificial intelligence and cloud computing run on Columbia River electricity. Apple orchards across Washington and Oregon drink from its reservoirs. Hundreds of thousands of homes in Portland and Seattle stay dry because Canadian dams hold back the floodwater that would otherwise pour south every spring. And the digital economy, the internet infrastructure that billions of people depend on, is partially anchored to this river's flow. When the Trump administration returned to power, one of its earliest foreign policy moves was to freeze negotiations on an updated version of this treaty. The Biden administration and Canada had spent years on a modernized agreement. By July 2024, they had reached a tentative deal. Canada would accept less hydropower, gain more storage flexibility, and receive over $37 million in direct payments from the United States. That agreement was never submitted to the Senate. Trump took office. The State Department paused negotiations as part of a broad review of international commitments. And with that quiet bureaucratic phrase, a deal that underpins the livelihoods of millions was placed on indefinite hold. Now here is where this story moves from a diplomatic dispute to something that touches your daily life. The ripple effects of stalling this treaty extend far beyond riverbanks. Because what Trump is signaling is not just about one agreement. It is about what he believes America is entitled to. During a September discussion about the Columbia River, Trump described British Columbia's water resources as a giant faucet, one that could be turned on to solve California's wildfires and the drought crisis gripping the American Southwest. That phrase, a giant faucet, is not diplomatic language. It is the language of entitlement. And it comes from a president who has already suggested Canada should become the 51st state, who has imposed punishing tariffs on Canadian goods, and who has made clear that he views bilateral agreements as negotiating positions rather than binding commitments. Canada is not a country that runs short on water. It holds approximately 20% of the entire planet's freshwater supply across 2 million lakes. On a per capita basis, Canada has more renewable freshwater than almost any nation on Earth, roughly 109,000 cubic meters per person per year. Lake Superior alone contains enough water to submerge both North and South America under 10 centimeters. The Great Lakes Basin supports an $8 trillion economy that would rank third in the world if it were an independent nation. This is what Trump is looking at when he looks north. Not a neighbor, a reservoir. And Canada's southern neighbor is drying out. The American Southwest is in the grip of what climate scientists now call a mega-drought, a multi-decade dry period reshaping the limits of agriculture, urban growth, and industrial production. The Colorado River, which has sustained Western American civilization for generations, is being consumed faster than snowmelt and rain can replenish it. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, have at various points in recent years dropped to historically catastrophic levels. In this context, the temptation to look at Canada's staggering freshwater wealth and treat it as a solution is not surprising. It is, however, dangerous. Mark Carney understood this from the moment he entered the Canadian election campaign. He repeated one line with the deliberate repetition of someone who wants every voter to memorize it. They want our land, they want our resources, they want our water, they want our country. Carney, a former central banker who built his career reading systemic risk, recognized that the water dispute was not merely about cubic meters crossing a border. It was a sovereignty test. And when Trump pressed, Carney refused. That refusal had teeth. Canada's freshwater is not legally accessible to the United States through presidential demand. The Great Lakes are protected by the Great Lakes Compact, signed into law by President George W. Bush in 2008, prohibiting large-scale diversions and requiring that any withdrawn water be replenished. Quebec and Ontario have parallel protections. These are not gentlemen's agreements. They are legally binding international compacts built on decades of environmental science and political commitment. And yet, according to reporting by the New York Times, Trump allegedly instructed Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick to relay a message to Canadian officials in February. He wanted to tear up the Great Lakes agreements. Not renegotiate, not modify through mutual consent. Tear them up. If accurate, that instruction represents something more serious than a diplomatic provocation. It represents a direct challenge to the legal architecture that has governed North American resource management for generations. It tells Canada, and tells every country watching, that under Trump, the United States treats international agreements as conveniences to be discarded when they become inconvenient. Jay Inslee, until recently the governor of Washington, put the psychological reality of these negotiations plainly. He said, Canadians feel a profound sense of betrayal. The treaty ties together an intricate web of cultural and economic interests, and it is not easy to negotiate under normal conditions. It becomes nearly impossible, he noted, when the party across the table treats you as an adversary rather than a partner. The expert consensus on what a genuine treaty breakdown would mean is unambiguous. Barbara Cozens, professor emerita at the University of Idaho College of Law and one of North America's leading experts on water law, has said a breakdown would be harder on the United States. If Canada were to stop managing upstream storage in ways that serve American hydropower and flood control, it is legally entitled to do so, Portland would face flooding not seen since 1948. Hydropower serving data centers, hospitals, and homes would become unpredictable. Agricultural economies built on Columbia River irrigation would face severe disruption. Canada holds extraordinary leverage, and it has chosen, so far, not to use it. Not because it lacks the means, but because doing so would violate the same principles of international cooperation that Carney is fighting to defend. The restraint is itself a message. Canada is saying, we could make this catastrophic for you, but we believe in the agreements that govern how neighbors behave. The question is whether that message is reaching anyone in Washington. Because the pattern of Trump's rhetoric, minerals, forests, Arctic territory, energy, and now water, suggests something more systematic than deal-making opportunism. It suggests a worldview in which geography is a ledger, and Canada's natural endowments are assets that should, in some sense, be available to meet American needs. Canadians are hearing it. At a Safeway in the Columbia Basin, local residents pulled their elected official aside to ask whether Canada should simply pull out of the treaty altogether. That is not a question being asked inside Parliament or at diplomatic tables. That is a question being asked in a grocery store aisle by ordinary people who feel in their bones that something built over generations is being threatened. Climate change is accelerating every pressure point in this story. Floods are projected to increase in frequency and severity across the Pacific Northwest. Droughts will intensify across the southern prairies and the interior of British Columbia. The glaciers feeding the Columbia River, the very glaciers that make this entire system function, are retreating. The hydrological future of the American Southwest and the Pacific Northwest is one of increasing scarcity, increasing volatility, and increasing competition for a resource that was, for generations, taken entirely for granted. What we are watching now are early tremors. The full seismic event is still building. What Carney's refusal ultimately represents is both simple and profound. At the simplest level, it is the only answer a sovereign government can give when asked to surrender control of a foundational natural resource. At a deeper level, it is a statement about what international order means in the 21st century. Historically, transboundary water agreements between Canada and the United States operated on what environmental studies professor Daniel McFarlane of Western Michigan University calls an honor system. It works when both parties bring genuine good faith to the table, when a signature means something, when an agreement ratified by one administration is not treated as optional by the next. What Trump has introduced into this system is strategic ambiguity, the deliberate unsettling of assumptions that allowed the system to function. And once ambiguity replaces honor, the entire framework becomes fragile. Not just for water, for everything. The world is watching. Canada is not the only country sitting on resources that a more powerful neighbor might one day covet. The precedent being set in North America right now, how the United States treats treaty obligations, how Canada responds to coercive pressure, whether international agreements can survive a partner who decides unilaterally that they no longer apply, will be studied in capitals from Brussels to Brasilia. In a world where water scarcity is becoming a driver of geopolitical conflict with the same intensity that oil once commanded, the way two of the world's most stable democracies manage their shared resource disputes matters enormously to every nation on Earth. If Canada yields, the message to every country watching is that treaties are optional when the more powerful party decides they are inconvenient. If Canada holds, and holds by upholding its own obligations while insisting the United States do the same, it models something the world urgently needs to see: that sovereignty is worth defending not with military force alone, but with legal commitment, diplomatic consistency, and the willingness to absorb economic pressure rather than surrender principle. The Columbia River is still flowing. The Great Lakes still hold their incomprehensible volume. Canada still holds the faucet. And right now, it is not turning it over to anyone. If you think water rights between nations are going to define the next century of geopolitical conflict, and the evidence says they will, tell us in the comments which country you think holds the real power in this dispute. We analyze the latest developments on this story every single day, so if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit subscribe so you never miss an update as this water war escalates.